My guest this week is Angus McNab. Angus has a Bachelor of Science, mastering in zoology, and did his research studying the rainforest frogs of northern Queensland. Angus is also the author of The Wildlife of Tasmania and has had a range of scientific papers published on the research he's done over the years. Angus is also an extremely accomplished photographer, having his works displayed in a range of different books and magazines. G'day Angus, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, no worries, good to be here.
You're an ecologist with a Bachelor of Science majoring in zoology. What sort of work does an ecologist do?
So an ecologist, a big part of their job is looking at sort of the interactions between wildlife and the plants and the environment that they live in, or the plants and the environment they live in. So rather than just strictly studying an animal or a part of the animal, you're sort of studying the animal and the environment it lives in.
Okay, and how does that differ from a zoologist?
So there's a lot of overlap in terms of you both might be studying particular animals. In general, a zoologist is looking at one aspect, or say maybe one species, and the biology of that animal itself, whereas an ecologist might be looking at how that species interacts with other species, whether that be predator or prey, or potentially what food items they might be eating, so how that animal interacts with the vegetation types and presence and absence of those.
And yourself, I know you did your master's in chytrid fungus that we'll talk about a bit later on. Are you interested in other areas?
Yeah, so I'm pretty open in terms of wildlife. Like my main interests are wildlife ecology, wildlife photography. So a lot of my work is wildlife surveys. That could be for anyone: mining companies, councils, government, parks and wildlife, state government branches of parks and wildlife. So looking at where animals live, a lot of it's for threatened species. So looking at where threatened species are, if they're still present, what sort of abundances they live in, and yeah, looking at them in general in the wild.
Where did that come from? Where did your interest in ecology and animals come from? Who were your main influences there?
I think it really started for me with Jurassic Park. I mean, I know a lot of young children are interested in dinosaurs, and I probably wouldn't say I had the biggest interest in dinosaurs, but Jurassic Park came out when I was about 9 years old, and that movie just blew my mind. And it wasn't long after that I was at a local pet shop getting probably some goldfish, or I think I kept axolotls at the time, and I saw bearded dragons in the pet shop and just thought they are the best things ever. And then realized, well, I think my mum told me that dinosaurs don't exist anymore. You know, they've died out. And
right.
I just thought, well, if there's no dinosaurs, this lizard that I saw at the pet shop is the next best thing. So I eventually, after, probably a year, talked my parents into allowing me to have some pet bearded dragons. And then I guess the interest just grew in terms of looking at how to look after them, and then realizing that there's so many other types of lizards and animals.
Now, you do have a very diverse background. I know you've written a lot of scientific papers on a number of different fauna groups. What is it about animals that inspires you the most? Is it like being out there seeing them, or is it part of the conservation side of it? What side of it is it?
It's sort of, I guess, a combination of a lot of things. One, there's a challenge in finding wildlife. They're pretty. There's excitement in seeing interactions and the way that they live, whether that be yellow-tailed black cockatoos tearing apart a tree, or an echidna digging up an ant nest. Maybe it's just a goanna running across the road as you drive past in the car. They're something that people have studied for a long time, but they have their own minds, they have their own lives. They live entirely without us. They don't need us as people, despite us thinking we're all important, and they just have their own lives. And I just find it fascinating to think how some of these things can survive, how they've adapted to different environments, and all the abilities that they have that we don't have. They can swim, they can fly, dig, all these things that, yeah, we have tools and have managed to overcome a lot of these things, but they just do it naturally without any issues. I just find that fascinating.
Now, are you a true generalist? I mean, I know you've written a lot of papers on different things. Do you have a favourite animal group?
I do. In general, I would say I'm pretty much a generalist of vertebrates. I've done work with botany, aquatic ecology, some marine stuff, and I do enjoy that, but my real interest is vertebrates. Most specifically, I'm into neotropical pit vipers, which is not the greatest thing when you live in Australia, and we don't have that animal group here, but it's always interesting just to see what's going on with them, and there's a lot of research being done globally on those.
Wow. Now, you did your master's on frogs, more specifically on the impacts of chytrid fungus on frogs in areas of lowland rainforest. For the people listening, what is chytrid fungus? Can you sort of give us an overview of what it is and how does it impact on frogs specifically?
So chytrid fungus is a naturally occurring fungus. There are a lot of different types of chytrid fungus that occur around the world. But at some point in sort of the 80s, there was just suddenly frogs started declining across the globe. And it took a long time to work out what was happening. But it turns out that there was a fungus that was being spread. Frogs were very susceptible and could get that fungus very easily. And when they had it in their body or on their body, it sort of altered the interactions in the way that their skin and their body functions sort of work. So there were sort of chemical imbalances, and the animal eventually succumbs to essentially a heart attack,
right,
which causes them to die. And for various reasons, some species were very, very susceptible and died out really quickly, just went extinct before people sort of even knew what was happening, where there's other species that have really had no impact on them. It doesn't seem to bother them at all. And then there's others that have sort of been a bit 50-50, like there's been declines, but depends on conditions and temperatures. And there's a lot of factors involved, but they've found that, this one fungus has really decimated frogs all over the world.
Wow. Okay. And is it globally naturally occurring, the fungus, or has it been spread by artificial means?
There's a lot of research being done on that. And at this point, I don't think there's still anyone's established where it actually is native to or where it originally came from. From memory, the oldest known record of chytrid fungus is from a museum specimen in North America from the 1800s. They went back and checked if frogs had it back in the day, and it turns out some frogs did. But then it's also, they think, native to Africa and was transported with African clawed frogs, which got sent all over the world. But then there's other papers that say it probably originated in Asia. So at the moment, it's pretty hard to say where it came from, but that it has obviously spread very well, and that's probably been in big part with people, but it may also have natural dispersers as well.
Yeah, okay. Now, your research, was it just on the impacts on populations in that particular type of rainforest, or did you do any sort of investigations on ways to help fight the impacts?
So my study looked at was taking a field approach to what has been done in the lab. So there's a lot of laboratory research that showed that chytrid is temperature sensitive. So it grows really well between about 4 and 28 degrees. Below that, it's too cold, and above that is too warm. It can still survive above and below that, but it doesn't reproduce as quickly, and it does start to die off. And so people have found that if you heat frogs up above 28 degrees for extended periods, then the chytrid fungus will die off. So I sort of took that approach and went into the field and looked at lowland populations of frogs that were susceptible to chytrid fungus, and looked at how they regulated their own body temperatures naturally. So all throughout the year, how they went about maintaining their own body temperatures and how that related to whether they did or didn't have chytrid fungus.
Right. And you say a number of species have been lost, probably even before we knew that they were being impacted by this. How many have been lost in Australia, or presumed lost?
I think at this point we're at about 7 extinct in Australia. So there was the gastric brooding frogs disappeared, a couple of species of tinker frog, and then a couple of Latoria species, the tree frog species. And we've been fortunate in some ways that we haven't lost as many as other countries have, but we still have 5 or 6 species that still are very, very much on the edge. So the 𝗏𝗏 frogs down in Victoria, the armoured mist frog in North Queensland, the 𝘀𝗵𝗿 tinker frog in sort of central Queensland, 𝘀𝗶𝗃𝗏𝗏 frogs in New South Wales, their populations have just been decimated, and captive breeding of most of those things is happening. But it'll be interesting to see how they go about getting them back into the wild, and if they can survive in the wild again.
Yeah. Any other environmental impacts? I mean, I know there's stacks of environmental changes going on around the globe. Are there any more specific that impact on frogs?
Frogs are sort of like most animals. They're susceptible to all the usual human-based impacts: pollution, changes in water quality. So erosion and runoff can interfere with water quality, and then they may not be able to breed in the rivers or creeks or water holes that they usually do. Habitat loss and introduced predators, cats and foxes, things like that. So they're not really too different to anything else. And whenever you hear of animals declining for human-induced impacts, the frogs are pretty much susceptible to all of those.
Does chytrid fungus only impact amphibians?
So the strand that infects amphibians is specific to amphibians. There's at least 80 different types of chytrid fungus known, but most of these are not specific to the frogs. So chytrid sort of lives on chitin, sort of fingernails, and that we have fingernails and hair type thing. So it can be on invertebrates, and it can be live on a number of different substrates. It's just that this one strand is susceptible to frogs. And I guess in relation to today's current climate, it's sort of like the 𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃. Like there's now this strain that's in people, but there's a number of other strains that have been studied for a long time that affect other animals. It's just that this one's sort of obviously made the move to people. So we have human coronaviruses now.
Yeah. Now we're going to listen to your first song choice, which is the theme from Jurassic Park by John Williams. Why did you pick this song?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think Jurassic Park was probably the start of my interest in wildlife, and then the progression through into the natural world, beyond sort of lizards and bearded dragons at the pet shop. So it's still probably my favourite movie of all time, and the theme song's just magical.
Welcome back. You just listened to the theme from Jurassic Park by John Williams. Now, Angus, although you do most of your work in Australia, you've also worked in other places like Borneo, North, Central and Southern America. Do you have any favourite places?
I probably have lots of favourite places. In general, I would say the tropical rainforests and deserts are my two favourite places. They're just diverse. You can walk the same track every single night for weeks on end, and you never know what you're going to see. There's going to be something different. And even if there isn't something different, you're still going to see heaps and heaps of different things. So anywhere that there's a good diversity of wildlife is where I'd like to be.
Okay, yeah, and as far as your international travel, I mean, obviously each of those environments have got their own specific challenges to work in. Internationally, is it easy to get around to the environments you want to go and study, or do you have to know the lingo, as it were?
It does vary a lot country to country. So I found Costa Rica, for example, you're not allowed to go into national parks outside of business hours of sort of 8 till 5, which makes it challenging because that's where obviously there's a lot of protected forest and good wildlife, but you're not allowed in there. In other places like the US, you can go into national parks anytime you want. It's all very easy. A lot of walking tracks, good facilities, easy to get around. And then I guess in other places, Borneo and Laos, a lot of places in Asia, it's a bit more difficult. There isn't a lot of protected areas and you're not always allowed into the protected areas. So it can be difficult, or more difficult in some places than others.
Yeah. Now, I know you're a very accomplished wildlife photographer. I've seen a lot of your stuff. It's awesome pictures. Now, you've had a lot of your images published. How many books have you contributed to?
Probably, I would say about 30. 30 sort of field guides, and then there's some apps and magazines and things. There's a few new books that I'm looking forward to seeing coming out that will have some images in there.
Okay.
The most recent one was actually a children's book about snakes, so that was something different.
And is this is this part of your business, as part of your income, or do you do it more for the awareness of wildlife?
It is not profitable at all, at least not for me. I find these days everyone's got a camera, and there's more and more people taking an interest in different aspects of the natural world and people taking photos. And a lot of wildlife photography is planning and targeting what you want to get photos of, but there's also a lot of luck involved, and any person can go to any nice place and get lucky and have get a good photo of an animal that just sort of pops up in front of them. And there's also these days camera trapping is making a lot of those things that weren't photographable much more photographable these days.
Right. So for you, it's more of like you do it while you're traveling. You don't specifically go somewhere to try and get pictures of something in particular. You're traveling anyway because of your research and things, and take your camera with you.
Yeah. So there's always a couple of things that I always try and specifically target. Often that's just vipers, but you're there and you've got the opportunity. So I'll pretty much photograph anything that I can while I'm there. And yeah.
Do you have any advice for any budding photographers who want to get their wildlife images noticed?
I'm probably not the best person to ask about this. I'm not big on self-promotion. I don't really do much of the social medias in terms of trying to promote my photography and my work.
So do you showcase it anyway?
I do. Yeah, I do have like a Flickr page, and most of my photos, if you searched on Google for various species that I've photographed, would come up in the Google results. But if people are wanting to get their photos out there, I think social media really is the big thing these days, and hashtagging companies that use photographs and companies that maybe are interested in photographs, and just all the usual hashtags and tagging people that are going to be interested in those types of things. But I would also suggest, I don't know, I've been taking photos for 15 years or so now, and you sort of see trends in the way photos are taken. And the big thing that gets me with or excites me about new photographers is when they do something different. At the moment, it's animals with wide angles, or say reptiles with wide angles, and reptiles and amphibians on white backgrounds. Like that's the current trend of photography. But every now and then you just see something like a different angle or a different perspective, and I'm like, oh, that person has just done their own thing, and I find that the most impressive.
So yeah, be unique and fresh.
Yeah, and people have been taking photos for hundreds of years, but there's still new things to be done and new ways to do things. So there's always options.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you also work as a tour guide, including on board cruise ships. Where do you go? Where do you conduct your tours?
So most of my tours have been through subantarctic New Zealand and the Kimberley of northwest WA, a couple of times up through the Great Barrier Reef. And unfortunately this year, or 2020, was when I had a number of tours booked into parts of Asia and Papua New Guinea. But yeah, COVID had other things to say about that. So we'll see what happens when cruising starts again.
Yeah. Now, how did you get into that type of work? Did someone just ask you to run a tour, or that was it?
I was pretty fortunate in that a friend of mine who I'd been volunteering with got an email from his friend saying that there was a company looking for some people to do sort of wildlife guiding on a cruise ship. And my friend who got the email was halfway through his PhD and didn't have time. And he said, "Oh, would you be interested?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'd be keen." And so I sent through an email, and that was pretty much it.
Awesome. Where's home then? Where do you base yourself when you're not traveling and running tours?
At the moment in Melbourne. I grew up in Frankston, and so still come back here, but I don't know how much longer I can deal with being back here. It's nice to visit and catch up with friends and family, but it's not the most diverse or exciting natural history wise.
Yeah, especially for the pit vipers that you're interested in.
Yeah.
You got to be traveling. Now, I know during lockdown you were stuck in Laos for a long time. I mean, stuck in Laos, you spent most of the lockdown period in Laos. Did you plan this, or did it just you happened to be stranded there?
No, it was a bit of I'll say happy accident. I had a 3-week break between contracts and decided to go to Laos to see a friend for 2 weeks. And COVID was becoming a thing, and I wasn't too worried about it because I had a flight in 4 or 5 days, and I honestly didn't think that Thailand would shut its airport to transit, and it did. So that meant that I was stuck in Laos for 8.5 months.
Yeah, wow. And was it total lockdown there, or you travelled around a bit?
Laos was fantastic. We had to do 6 to 8 weeks lockdown, sort of as most of the world did in that March-April period, or April-May. But Laos was fortunate. It shut its borders to international travel extremely quickly. They shut down all the province borders, which is sort of like the state borders, during that period. And COVID sort of didn't get in. So once that lockdown finished, we were free to do anything except for leave Laos.
Right.
So I bought a motorbike and spent a couple of months just traveling around the country and looking at different places and villages and temples and wildlife where I could. So yeah, it actually was fantastic.
Awesome. Now we're going to listen to your second song, Every Single Day by Pennywise. Can you tell us a bit more about this one?
So I would say this is my favorite song of all time. I like a lot of punk rock music. It's hard, it's fast, upbeat. And for me, this one, I mean, it's called Every Single Day, and it's sort of just a reminder that every day is a new day. We all get down at times, and this one's a good one just to remember, like, it's a new day. You can forget about what's happened in the past and move on. So, yeah.
Okay, that was Every Single Day by Pennywise. I'm chatting to Angus McNab. Now, Angus, you obviously handle wildlife as part of your work. What permits do you need, just for anybody who's listening that, maybe they want to get into that sort of work, or, they're out there taking their photographs and they want to move something into a better position? Are they allowed to?
It's a tough one. Like, legally in Australia, all wildlife is protected, which means you can't interfere with wildlife for any reason. And you do require permits, which are very difficult to get as an individual. If you're part of an organisation, a company that works on wildlife, field naturalist groups can sometimes have permits. There's quite a lot required in terms of justifying why you need the permits, why you need to interfere with the wildlife, getting ethical permission or ethical permits from another group to justify and that you're going to do things correctly, which really I I totally understand, and I think it's a very important system. In some ways, it does also take away from that learning experience of people. I know I was speaking with a relative recently, and she was telling me how every year the frogs would breed in a depression in her backyard. So she collected the frogs the tadpoles into a bucket because they would have dried out and died, and she didn't know what to do with them. So she rang up a frog expert who got really angry at her for having taken the tadpoles and put them in a bucket. You know, she shouldn't have moved them, and sort of doesn't give a good impression of people of. I mean, you've got to explain things and why. So all she wanted to do was try and save these tadpoles in her backyard, but was told that's not the right thing to do, and it makes it hard. And then with the photography side of things, it's hard too, because you're not allowed to, again, interfere with the wildlife. So picking up animals, you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to put them in better places to try and get photos, which most people do. And it's hard to sort of say, and I've done this at times, there's a snake on the road as you're going down the highway. I'll pull over and get that snake off the road. It's not something you're really allowed to do, but the snake's going to get run over if you don't do it. So it's a bit of a, what's the right thing to do there? You're not trying to break the law by interfering, but you're trying to help an animal just to get off the road. And that happens with echidnas and all kinds of different things. So it's best to avoid interfering for any reason if you can. But I don't think people are going to get too upset if you're trying to help save something.
Exactly. That's what I was about to say. If you're doing a good Samaritan act, your intent is right. It's not as if you're manipulating that animal for your own benefit. You're trying to save it or help it. Are there any animals that scare you?
I want to say no.
Okay.
In terms of just, I don't know. I don't think there's anything that scares me. Would I be nervous in the water with a great white? Yes, but it's probably something I want to do. It's on the top of my almost to-do list with wildlife. So it'd be terrifying, but I think it would also be amazing.
Yep.
But outside of sharks, I don't think there's too much that scares me. You've just got to, I find these days, if you're in a situation that's not a good situation, so maybe you've accidentally stepped on a brown snake or very close to a brown snake or a tiger snake or something, you just back away slowly and it's going to leave you alone, you leave it alone. So there's not too much really, particularly in Australia, to be scared of.
Have you been bitten yourself?
I have been bitten. Fortunately, only once by a venomous snake. I was bitten by a western brown snake when I was 18, and that was enough. One bite's enough.
Yep.
And I mean, I've been bitten by some non-venomous things, carpet pythons and common tree snakes and things, but that's more due to me knowing that they're not of any concern. And if I used to take snakes out of people's houses while I was at university, so removing snakes from houses, if I knew it wasn't dangerous and I had to stick my arm in a hole to pull it out of the roof, then I was willing to do so. And those sort of bites aren't an issue.
Okay. And so with things that are venomous that you are working with, like you said, you might remove a snake off the road or something like that. What precautions do you take?
The biggest one is just assessing whether it's worth doing what you're about to do. If you're in the middle of nowhere, and even for me, like if I'm doing a research project and it's involving venomous snakes, if I'm in the middle of nowhere, it's a hot day, the snake's agitated, the best thing to do is just leave it alone. And I think rather than put yourself in a risky situation of trying to catch it so you can take measurements or something, if it's the wrong time or the snake's too angry, you just say, well, we'll try again another day. So the best thing is to just avoid being in those dangerous situations.
Okay. So when you're out doing your field surveys for part of your research work, how do you ensure the animal's welfare?
There's a few things you can do. Having good training is probably the best one, and not just training in handling animals, but how to set traps correctly and your proper handling techniques and just things that you can do to reduce the stress that will be on those animals. So when you're trapping them, you'll check your traps in the mornings and the afternoons, and you'll pick animals up out of buckets or maybe out of Elliott traps. And for most surveys, it's just identification. And so you can pull the animal out, say what it is or write down what it is, let it go, and just reduce the time that animal is either in the trap or in your hands. And also, I mean, it comes with practice, but learning how to hold the animals correctly. And one of the biggest things that I see a lot of people doing is really holding on tight, which is a good thing. You don't want the animal to sort of get loose or to bite you. But often I find if you're holding an animal so that it can't move, you can still be very gentle about holding it.
Right.
And that way that you can tell the animal has just calmed down. And often with things like rats, which you really don't want to get bitten by because it hurts.
Yep.
You hold them, and at the end, you can often find at the end, even though you've been measuring feet or whatever it is you need to do, come the end of it, you can essentially just let go of the animal in your hand and it will just sit there before running off. Like they're not trying to bite you, but at the same time you see someone scruffing, like holding an animal by the back of the neck, taking the measurements, doing what they do, and then as soon as they loosen their grip, the animal bites them. And I think there's just that the animal's so scared and not being in a good position, and its welfare is sort of not necessarily been the top priority there. So if you can do things calmly, quickly, then the animals really benefit from that.
Awesome. Now, again, for people that are listening, is there any way that they can get involved in this sort of work if they want to see if it's for them?
Yeah, I mean, there's the sort of longer term approach. If you've decided this is for you, there's university courses, TAFE courses. Sorry, and there's a lot more options now than sort of. I mean, I went through uni in 2005. I started, and now there's a lot more courses. There's a lot more options in terms of land management, wildlife care, zoology, botany. Sort of, they've always been the two main ones, but there's other sort of options as well, environmental sciences and things like that. But also if maybe it's just an interest more than you want it as a potential career, there's a lot of organizations that will take volunteers and you don't necessarily need any qualifications or experience. Universities, Conservation Australia, Wildlife, I've just had a mental blank, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Bush Heritage, groups like that. They'll take volunteers and you can go out and get experience with wildlife, with plants, with the natural world and say, yeah, maybe this is something you want to take up as a hobby or maybe more than that.
Okay, awesome. And we're going to listen to your third song now, which is Sandstorm by 𝘬𝗲𝗏. Why did you select that song?
Sandstorm is probably the song I've listened to more than any other song. Electronic and dance music hasn't always been something I've been into, but this song has just been repeatedly played in my life and I absolutely love it.
Oh, welcome back. You just listened to Sandstorm by 𝘬𝗏. Angus, I know you've written a book on the wildlife of Tasmania. What made you to decide to do Tasmania?
Well, a few years ago, I'd been living in Queensland. I was there for about 10 years and was ready for a change and moved down to Tasmania. And obviously I went pretty quickly to the bookshop and bought all the field guides for Tasmania. I'm pretty big on field guides. I really like looking at field guides. And I couldn't buy the reptile one because it was out of print. The amphibian book was fantastic. And then a couple of the other books that had been published I just found not entirely complete or potentially out of date. They were a bit older. And I just thought, well, I've seen a lot of the stuff that lives in Tassie. I've photographed a lot of the stuff that's in Tassie. I think I could put sort of, an updated version of these books together. And yeah, so I just sort of took that on as a sort of side project and worked on trying to cover all of Tassie's vertebrates in one book.
Wow. It is a great book. I've looked at it. It's just so awesome, so well laid out. How long did it take you to write it?
I was working on it for about 3 years on and off. I mean, it wasn't my full-time work, but it was sort of something that between work projects and when I had time, I worked on, over about 3 years.
And what were some of the biggest challenges that you found while you were working on it?
There was a few different things. One, getting photographs of all the animals. I was fortunate in that I got a lot of photos off a lot of other great photographers who were really helpful in getting it all together. And then also for certain things, just trying to determine facts about the different animals. So one of the things that I included in there was breeding periods. And so, for example, Australia has sort of 5 major field guides for birds already. And the breeding periods that they listed don't match at all between the books. So
oh, wow.
Some say late summer, some say early summer, some say spring, autumn, some say, year round. And you're sort of like, well, how come these 5 sort of different books have all got 5 different opinions? And then, having to delve deeper into data and research projects and look at work that's been done on those species, specifically in Tasmania where it had been, to work out sort of when breeding periods were and things like that.
Yeah. And there's a number of endemic species for Tasmania. How many do you know off the top of your head?
So there's 30 endemic species in Tasmania, 3 frogs, 7 reptiles, 8 mammals, and 12 birds.
Okay. And are they fairly easy to see?
That depends, I guess, a little bit on experience, but most of the birds are fairly easy. The frogs are also easy. They're generally the easier groups because they call and you can listen out for them. The reptiles are fairly common through most of the state. The exception to that is the 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃 skink that lives only on 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃 south of Tasmania, which is a small rock island, but it's off limits to the public. It's a scientific reserve, so you can't actually visit that island to see that skink.
Right, okay. And mammals, so I'm sure a lot of the listeners will be familiar with the 𝘬𝗲𝗍𝗃 devil.
Yeah.
Is that considered an endemic to Tasmania, despite it being formerly more widespread?
Yeah, so it is considered an endemic. It did, and a lot of the Tasmanian, well, a couple of the Tasmanian mammals, barred bandicoot, Tasmanian paddymmelon as well, used to occur throughout mainland Australia, or at least in parts of mainland Australia, but are now restricted to the island of Tasmania.
Okay. Have you done much work with the 𝘬𝗍𝗃 devil? I mean, I know that the population's been impacted by the devil facial tumour disease.
Yeah, I did not a lot of work, but I spent a bit of time in the field camera trapping and trapping devils, putting collars on devils and quolls and cats and looking at sort of how they, well, helping a friend with her project, looking at how they all interact and differences in behaviour and things like that. But the facial tumours disease is pretty terrible. Not the nicest thing to look at either, from just a physical point of view, but obviously impacts dramatically on the devils.
And are you aware of any work that's been done to help protect the species?
So there's a couple of breeding facilities occurring even in mainland Australia, and then we've got a couple of island populations. The main one that people might be aware of being Maria Island, which is disease-free. So the devils are breeding, and there is some introductions back onto mainland Tasmania. There's also some evidence now that devils are surviving, or I guess I'll say immune to the facial tumour disease. However, it sounds good in one aspect, but it's also due to a loss of genetic diversity that they're surviving. So,
right, okay,
pluses and minuses there.
Yeah. The other famous Tasmanian mammal, I guess, is the Thylacine, or Tassie tiger, being declared extinct many years ago now. The last one dying in captivity about 1936. Do you think there's still some out there?
Unfortunately, no. Tasmania is not that big an area, and yes, the western half of Tasmania is relatively inaccessible. However, due to the devil facial tumour disease, there's been, I don't even know, tens of thousands of camera traps put out across the state for extensive periods of time, and they're baited with baits that would attract a thylacine if they existed. And I just think at this point, it's been 70, 80 odd years, and there's been so much work that should have detected them, that if they were there, they would have been seen.
Yeah, exactly. On the bird side of it, I know there's an extremely rare, critically endangered parrot species called the orange-bellied parrot. Can people still see those?
They can. Tasmania is the place to see them. They do migrate back to sort of Victoria, potentially South Australia or the southern edge of New South Wales each year. But Tasmania is the main place, and the tiny little, I wouldn't even call it a town, it's a couple of buildings in the southwest at 𝘂𝗏𝗃𝗃 is the best place to see them. And there are species that have been declining for at least the last, I guess, 25 years. But due to some very dedicated people, there's been captive breeding, captive releases, and a lot of work done on trying to maintain that population. And I think this year they had the biggest increase in numbers of birds in the wild that they've had ever. So.
Okay. And do you know what the population size is at the moment?
I want to say that I think I read there was about 100 birds this year that they've got in the wild now.
Okay.
I know a few years ago it got down to, I think there was 14 wild birds, but through captive breeding and then some sort of releasing the captive birds and trying to get them to breed with the wild birds, and a lot of introductions, that the numbers are seeming to be going up.
Oh, good. That's great news. Now we're going to listen to your fourth song now, Get Your Freak On by Missy Elliott. Can you tell us about this song?
I just love Missy Elliott for no particular reason. Fantastic film clips, very upbeat, and just sort of her music's, I guess, I find it a little bit random, which I think life is, and it's just sort of, it all goes together so well.
Okay, we just listened to Get Your Freak On by Missy Elliott, and I'm talking to Angus McNab. Now, Angus, we're talking about your book before the song, the book on the Wildlife of Tasmania. Are you working on any other books at the moment?
I'm working on a few sort of other projects, one being a Victorian guide to wildlife. So essentially it's going to be the same as the Tasmanian book, but for Victoria. So a guide to all the vertebrates, where to see them, when to see them, with photos of all the males and females and where suitable, the young, so that anyone with an interest in Victorian wildlife can see everything that the state has to offer.
Okay, awesome. And how far along are you with that one?
I'm going to say about halfway through, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a slow process.
Yeah. Well, if it took 3 years for 𝘂𝗲𝗃𝗃, I'm guessing there's a few more species in Victoria you got to cover.
Yes, Victoria is about twice the size in terms of species numbers.
Any other books?
So also been working on the Wildlife of Australian Rainforest, which is coming to a close. That one's almost finished up, and will hopefully be on shelves this year.
And I know you did some of your early research work in rainforests, and you said earlier that rainforests and deserts are your two sort of favourite ecosystems. Was this a good book to work on? Did you enjoy working on it?
Yeah, I did. It's definitely been a learning experience. I don't know, I think everyone gets that sort of self-awareness of like, I know things. And then when it comes to actually explaining those things to someone else, you realize you don't know it as well as you thought you did. So this book there was again, a lot of learning for me, which is always nice just to sort of update your own knowledge. And it's the first book I've worked on with other people, which was another good new experience.
Okay. And Australia for rainforests, I mean, you think of East Coast being it. Is there rainforests around Australia?
Yeah, so it is. I mean, even for me, when I think of rainforest, I think of the wet tropics in northeast Queensland. But there's rainforest in Tasmania, which I guess most people don't think of because rainforest, obviously, I think for most people, has a tropical association.
Yeah.
But there's dry rainforest, temperate rainforest, obviously tropical rainforests, and then also sort of vine thickets. So over in Western Australia, up in the Kimberley region, you get these sort of tropical vine thickets, which are a type of rainforest, but don't look anything like a rainforest that you would expect from the East Coast with, big tall trees and ferns and things like that.
So, I mean, this is, your third book now. How do you decide what to write about? I mean, I know with the Tassie one, you said that you felt like you could put something together and to maybe fill some blanks and consolidate what was already out there. But, does it just say, oh, this is something I want to write about? Or do you identify like maybe a bit of a gap in the market and go, yeah, I'll fill that niche?
Yeah, I think for these ones, it's been more of a gap in the market and also a sort of a bit of I live here. And it's a sort of an excuse for me to then go out and look for different wildlife to get photos, but also to learn more about what lives, in the areas that I spend my time. And the Victoria one was somewhat a matter of just, there wasn't really any Victorian books. There is now a very nice Reptiles of Victoria book. And, there's a mammal book from the 80s, but it's out of print and you can't get that anymore. So there's never been a Victorian bird book that I'm aware of. There isn't as yet a Victorian frog book or an up-to-date Mammals of Victoria book. So just thought, well, I may as well have a go at trying to sort of fill that gap, and hopefully just it brings awareness to people of what lives in Victoria. And there really is a lot of wildlife that lives in Victoria.
Yeah, and it's quite a diverse state as far as it's got the mountainous alpine areas and obviously, a number of extensive wetlands, but also the mallee and things like that. So you've got a variety of environments.
Very much so. And then also a very large coastal area, which provides habitat for migratory species that come in from overseas. And so the state can very much be divided into different regions of mallee, Alps, coast, and then agricultural land, which a lot of sort of northwest Victoria and the northern parts of Victoria are.
Okay. So any advice for people that want to write a book?
I think if you have the interest in writing one, or you have an interest in a specific topic that you think other people would benefit from, then it's well worth looking into. So I guess firstly looking at whether anyone else has done a book similar to what you're wanting to do, or if there's nothing, then maybe you should be the one to go out and start it.
Yeah, great idea. And 3 years of part-time work, it's not extremely profitable writing natural history books, but gets another, I suppose, reward.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really any financial gain to be made from most books, and particularly if they're sort of specific. So my Tasmanian book is really not of much use outside of Tasmania. So it's a limited market there, but there's a lot of other titles that, you could work on that would have a broader audience range that might be of more financial gain. But beyond that, there's people recognize that you've done a lot of work on a topic that they might be interested in. There's sort of potentially other options for other books with other people, or even just work-wise, like it's something else you can add to your resume. There isn't all that many people who have written books on all kinds of different things. So it, for some things, may make you the expert on that topic in that area.
Yeah, definitely. Going back to your Tassie book, the tourism stats are pretty bad at the moment, so that's obviously impacted on your sales. But typically, Tasmania is a popular tourism destination. I think the numbers are about 1.3 million per annum. So potentially, a number of those people would be interested in seeing the wildlife there.
Yeah, and I guess that's a big part of the market, and one area that Tassie does do well is the tourism. Like, a lot of people do move through the state, and Tasmania does have a reputation as a sort of a wild state. There's a lot of well-known overnight bushwalks, the overland track, the 𝗃𝗵𝗃𝗀𝗆𝗃, which opened up a few years ago, and there's a lot of wildlife to be seen on those walks. And there's also just a lot of wildlife. It's very easy to see animals in Tasmania, so people do go there to see the wildlife.
Okay, cool. Can you introduce your last song and tell us why you picked it?
So the last song is Punk Rock and Roll by the Street Dogs. This is a song that I only came across a couple of years ago, and punk rock is my sort of go-to general easy listening. I know most people might not find it so easy to listen to, but for me it is. And this song is just hard and fast, really upbeat, and really what I'd like in a song.
Okay, we're just listening to Punk Rock and Roll by the Street Dogs, and yeah, definitely upbeat, Angus, and gets you up and moving. Now, I want to thank you for taking the time out today and chatting with us about your amazing experiences you have with your ecology work and your photography and your tourism and your book writing. Definitely never a dull moment in your life by the sounds of it.
Well, possibly a little bit too much time at the computer for me, but it's part of it, so you've got to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, thanks again, mate. I really appreciate your time. It's been great.
Been good to have a chat.